For 10 relentless years, the sands of the Aegean bore witness to a war that defied all expectations. This was not a battle of swift conquests, nor decisive victories. It was a war of patience, a slow, grinding conflict, where hunger, exhaustion, and time itself became weapons far deadlier than any sword. The Mycenaean army, hardened by years of bloodshed, had sailed across the sea in pursuit of conquest. But what they found was not an easy victory, but an immovable force. Troy, an impregnable stronghold of stone and legend, a city whose walls had withstood the fury of kings, the fire of war, and the relentless charge of an empire. The battlefield before its gates had become a graveyard, littered with the remains of countless failed assaults. The once proud warriors of Greece now lived in the shadows of Troy's walls, their armor dulled by time, their bodies weary from a war that refused to end. But what made Troy so formidable? Why did it stand, defying the might of the Mycenaean war machine? And in the end, how did it fall? To understand the fate of Troy, we must first uncover what made it so impenetrable. What secrets lay behind those walls? What minds had shaped its defenses? For in the end, it was not just the might of armies that dictated the outcome. It was the power of strategy, of patience, and of deception. But had the Trojans always expected war? Some believed their city was untouchable, that its high walls and deep trade alliances would protect it forever. Others, more cautious, had long prepared for such a siege, stockpiling supplies, reinforcing defenses, long before the Greek fleet arrived. Its walls, carved from the bones of the earth, loomed high above the battlefield. Impenetrable, unyielding, for centuries, these walls had stood as a symbol of Troy's strength, built not just to defend against an attack, but to turn any invasion into a death trap. Rising over 15 meters high in places, their sheer height alone made scaling them nearly impossible. Attackers who reached the base found no footholds, no weak points, only cold, unyielding stone staring back at them. But Troy's defenses were far more than just height and thickness. They were a system, a layered fortress designed to trap and exhaust the enemy. The outer walls formed the first barrier, massive stone blocks stacked in an interlocking pattern, ensuring they could withstand even the heaviest blows. Inside the main fortifications, a second defensive line awaited, a network of inner walls, high towers, and narrow passageways. These were designed to funnel attackers into kill zones, where Trojan archers could rain arrows from above and defenders could strike from hidden positions. Defenders didn't need to fight in open battle. They could wear down their enemies, forcing them into bottlenecks where they became easy targets. The Scaean gates, the grandest entrance to the city, were more than just an entry point. They were a death trap. Narrow and reinforced, they forced attackers into a confined space where they were vulnerable from all sides. If an enemy reached the gates, they would find themselves met with boiling oil, spears thrust from above, and walls too thick for battering rams to break in a single strike. Yet, Troy's greatest weapon was not its walls alone, but the ingenuity of its defenders. The Trojans did not simply wait behind stone and mortar. They adapted, they countered, they anticipated. They knew that siege warfare was not only about defense, but about outlasting the enemy. For 10 years, the Greeks tried to breach these walls. For 10 years, they failed. But even the mightiest fortress has its weakness, and the Mycenaeans were determined to find it. The Greeks had come to Troy as conquerors. They believed their overwhelming numbers and superior weaponry would bring the city to its knees. But what they encountered was not an easy conquest. It was a fortress that refused to fall. The first assaults were brutal. The Mycenaean warriors, led by Agamemnon, Achilles, and Ajax, charged the walls with siege ladders and battering rams. They hurled themselves at the defenses, hoping to break through with sheer force. But each time, they were repelled. From atop the battlements, Trojan archers rained death upon them. Arrows struck down warriors before they could even reach the walls. Defenders pushed back ladders, sending Greek soldiers plummeting to their deaths. Any who reached the gates were met with boiling oil, fire, and a storm of spears. Siege towers, massive wooden structures meant to give attackers a vantage point, were set ablaze before they could be used. Battering rams splintered against the iron-reinforced gates, failing to breach the city's outer defenses. In the Greek camp, frustration festered. Warriors who had once sailed to Troy in pursuit of glory now whispered of home, of the families they had left behind. And Achilles, the mightiest of them all, seethed in silence, doubting whether Agamemnon's pride had doomed them all to an unwinnable war. Realizing that brute force alone would not take the city, the Greeks turned to another tactic: siege warfare, a slow, methodical war of starvation. They blockaded Troy's harbors, cutting off trade routes that supplied the city with grain, livestock, and fresh water. They raided the villages and outposts surrounding Troy, seizing food and resources meant to sustain the defenders. If the city could not be taken by force, it would be starved into surrender. For the Trojans, survival became a battle of endurance. Food was rationed, wells were carefully monitored, supply lines had to be defended at all costs. But Troy had an advantage: it had long prepared for war. Hidden underground storage reserves allowed the city to last longer than expected. Its people had adapted, proving they were just as resilient as their walls. Months turned into years, the siege dragged on, and with it, a different kind of battle emerged, one fought in the minds of warriors. The years of fighting took their toll, not just on Troy, but on the Greeks as well. The Mycenaean war camp, once full of eager warriors, became a land of frustration and fatigue. Soldiers who had left home expecting a quick victory now found themselves growing old on foreign soil. Supplies ran low, disease crept through the camp, and worst of all, morale began to break. Many warriors began to question the purpose of the war. Some longed for home, their minds filled with memories of the families they had left behind. Others doubted the very cause of their struggle. Was the abduction of Helen truly worth this endless bloodshed? Even the greatest among them, Achilles, the mightiest Greek warrior, withdrew from battle, disgusted by the politics of war and the arrogance of his commander, Agamemnon. The Greeks were not just fighting Troy anymore. They were fighting exhaustion, despair, and the creeping fear that they had come all this way only to fail. And yet, Troy remained defiant. But the Mycenaeans knew no wall could stand forever. If they could not take the city by force or by starvation, they would need something far more insidious. They would need deception. After 10 years of relentless war, Troy still stood. The Greeks had thrown everything they had at its walls: siege engines, fire, starvation. But nothing had broken the city's defenses. The battlefield had become a graveyard. The war, a test of endurance. But time was running out. Supplies were dwindling. Soldiers were weary. The Mycenaean warlords faced a grim choice: abandon the siege or find a way to end it once and for all. They needed a new strategy, one that did not rely on brute force, but on deception. A strategy that would turn Troy's own strength into its weakness. And so, the Greeks conceived their greatest trick, the Trojan Horse. The Greeks knew that no wall, no matter how strong, could withstand an attack that came from within. And so, they devised an illusion, a ruse so audacious that it would bypass Troy's mighty gates without a single blow. Under the guidance of Odysseus, the most cunning of all the Greek commanders, the Mycenaeans constructed a colossal wooden horse, standing tall, as if it had been carved by the gods themselves. The structure was hollow, its insides large enough to conceal a group of elite warriors. To the Trojans, it would appear as an offering, a symbol of Greek surrender. And so, once the horse was complete, the Greeks set fire to their own camp, destroyed their tents, and sailed away, vanishing beyond the horizon. Or so it seemed. At sunrise, the Trojans stood atop their walls, gazing out at an abandoned battlefield. The enemy was gone. Only the great wooden horse remained, standing solemn and unmoving before the gates. Had they won? Had the mighty Mycenaean army truly given up? The Trojans, battle-worn and desperate for an end to war, ventured out to examine the abandoned Greek encampment. The remains of their enemy's ships smoldered in the distance. And in the center of it all, the mysterious wooden horse stood in eerie silence. Even among Troy's leaders, doubt flickered. Aeneas, a warrior of noble blood, hesitated. "What if this is not a gift, but a trick?" he murmured to Antenor, a Trojan elder known for his caution. But the city was weary of war, and the need for victory silenced reason. The gates were opened, but doubt was not enough to overpower the desire for victory. The Trojans, eager to celebrate, made a fateful decision. They would bring the horse inside the city walls, placing it in the heart of Troy as a trophy of their triumph. They tore down part of their own fortifications to make way for it. And as the great wooden structure passed through the gates, the people cheered, rejoicing at what they believed was the end of the war. That night, Troy celebrated. Music filled the streets, torches burned bright. The long nightmare of war seemed finally over. But as the city slept, hidden inside the horse, Greek warriors waited in silence, their swords drawn, their mission clear. Troy had not won a victory, it had invited its doom. Midnight, the city of Troy lay in silence, its streets empty, save for the flickering glow of torches. The people slept soundly, believing that for the first time in a decade, the war was over. Victory had been claimed, and the Trojan horse, a symbol of their triumph, stood motionless in the city's heart. But within its hollow belly, Greek warriors lay in wait, their breaths shallow, their weapons drawn. They had remained hidden for hours, cramped in darkness, listening to the sounds of celebration echoing outside. And now, at last, it was time. A faint creaking broke the silence. The panel of the wooden horse slid open, and from the darkness, shadows emerged. One by one, Greek warriors dropped onto the stone streets of Troy. They moved swiftly, silently, their forms blending into the night. Among them was Odysseus, the mastermind of the deception, his eyes scanning the city like a predator. At the same time, beyond the walls, the Greek fleet, once thought to have retreated, returned under the cover of darkness. The ships glided toward the shore, carrying soldiers eager to finish what had begun 10 years prior. The gates of Troy, once unbreakable, were about to be opened from within. The warriors inside the city moved quickly, killing the unsuspecting guards stationed near the gates. Their bodies fell silently, their warnings forever unspoken. Then, with a deep groan of shifting stone and wood, the mighty gates of Troy, closed for a decade, swung open. And through them, the Mycenaean army poured in. Troy's nightmare had begun. The streets, once filled with laughter and music, now erupted in screams. The Trojan people awoke to chaos. Flames began to rise, torches hurled onto rooftops, turning homes into infernos. Soldiers stormed through the city, cutting down anyone in their path. Warriors, elders, women, children. No one was spared. The Trojan army, caught off guard and leaderless, tried desperately to fight back. They grabbed whatever weapons they could, rallying in the palace courtyard. But it was already too late. The Greeks had taken the city, piece by piece. Blood ran through the streets, staining the stone red. Troy, the city that had withstood siege for 10 years, fell in a single night. Deep within the palace, King Priam, the ruler of Troy, stood surrounded by his remaining guards. His sons had fallen. His city was in ruins. Yet he refused to flee. Clutching his sword, he made his final stand within the sacred halls of his ancestors. But the gods had abandoned him. In a brutal, merciless act, he was slain before the altar of Zeus. His lifeless body left as a grim offering to the victors. Elsewhere, Trojan women and children were rounded up, taken as spoils of war. Among them was Queen Hecuba, Andromache, the widow of Hector, and Cassandra, the doomed prophetess who had foreseen Troy's fall but whose warnings had gone unheeded. There were no victors here, only the conquered and the dead. By dawn, the city of Troy was no more. What was once a kingdom of wealth and power had been reduced to smoldering ruins. Its towers had collapsed. Its temples lay in rubble, and its people, those who had not been slaughtered, were now prisoners, destined to be taken across the sea as slaves. The Greeks had won, but at what cost? 10 years of bloodshed had led to this moment. A city in ashes, a war remembered for eternity. Yet, in the shadows of destruction, legends tell of survivors, of those who escaped the burning city and carried the Trojan legacy into a new age. Among them, it is said, was Aeneas, a Trojan prince who would one day sail westward and lay the foundations of Rome. The war was over, but its echoes would shape history for millennia to come. Troy had fallen, but its war was not merely a conflict of swords and sieges. It was a war of heroes. A war fought by warriors whose names would outlive the city itself. Achilles, the unstoppable force. Hector, the valiant defender. Odysseus, the cunning strategist. Agamemnon, the ruthless king. Paris, the man who ignited a war. These men were more than warriors. They were legends. Their deeds, immortalized in myth and song. But who were they, really? Did these figures exist? Or were they merely creations of poets and storytellers? What made them the greatest warriors of their time? And what ultimately became of them? Join us in episode 6, as we uncover the heroes of Troy, Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and more. Their battles, their legacies, their fate.